Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech for you. This is deck number 171 and it's titled Nissa 90 Lands. And if you haven't seen the show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or working with suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So our random card this week was suggested to us by Richard over on Discord/Patreon, and that card is Lost in the Woods. And Lost in the Woods is 3 green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a forest card, remove that creature from combat. Then put the revealed card on the bottom of your library. So obviously we want to play a deck that has a lot of forests. That does mean that we are going to be in mono green this week because I did want to maximize the number of forests we could play. And if I'm being perfectly honest, every single land in our entire deck is a forest because I figured that way that gives us the best chance. And when I was looking at commanders, I couldn't find a great one that really stuck out to me until I found a specific Nissa. And while there really aren't a ton of Nissas that can be your commander, there's in fact only 2. The one that really stuck out to me was Nissa Vastwood Seer. And she stuck out to me for a couple of reasons. So first, let's read through her card, see what she does, and then I'll explain why she's at the helm of this deck. So Nissa is 2 and a green for a legendary creature elf scout. When she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic forest card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. Whenever a land enters under the battlefield under your control, if you control 7 or more lands, exile Nissa, then return her to the battlefield transformed under her owner's control. Once she flips, she becomes Nissa Sage Animist with 3 loyalty. +1, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield, otherwise put it into your hand. -2, put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashaya the Awoken World onto the battlefield. And -7, untap up to 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creatures and they're still lands. So there's a lot of text on this card, but I want to point out 3 major reasons that I chose Nissa as our commander. So first off, when she comes in, we can search our library for a basic forest. That's great. We're hoping to have a ton of those. And whenever a land enters, if we have 7 or more lands, we transform her. Getting 7 or more lands when our deck has a lot of forests is not going to be a problem. Then, on the backside, we can +1 to reveal the top card of our library. If it's a land, we put it into play, which again, since we have a lot of forests, there's a high probability of that. And the most important reason that I wanted to pick Nissa is because she's a planeswalker that has a win condition stapled to her. Lost in the Woods specifies that if a creature attacks us or a planeswalker we control, we can prevent that combat damage, meaning it's a lot easier for us to flip Nissa and then ultimate her when we can protect her with Lost in the Woods, and eventually get to that -7, just making 6/6/6 creatures, putting 36 power onto the board right away, which if we've also gotten Ashaya, that is 40, and that is just enough to take someone out from their starting life total. So at this point, you might be wondering, or maybe not necessarily wondering if you read the title, how many lands are we actually going to be playing in this deck? Because we want to have the best chance possible of flipping a forest off of Lost in the Woods. So when I posted this question last week on YouTube, I got a lot of people saying you maybe want 40, 50, we even had some people suggest 60. And while that's good, even putting 50 lands in means you have a 50-50 shot of flipping over a land. 50% is pretty good. However, I wanted more. I wanted us to almost guarantee that we could hit a forest every single time. So I started tinkering with the deck and trying to figure out what is the most number of cards we could do. Obviously, we could play just Nissa and 99 lands. Well, I guess 98 with Lost in the Woods. But that didn't seem quite enough because then we're just struggling to find Lost in the Woods. So I actually settled on 90. We have 10 non-land cards in the entire deck and then 90 forests to go along with it, giving us a 90% chance every single time we're attacked to be able to flip a forest with the Lost in the Woods. Obviously, that is not a 100% chance. We can still get hit, but I kind of like those odds. Every 1 out of 10 attacks gets through. That's pretty decent in my eyes. I will take that. So what that means, though, is the deck tech that I'm about to walk you through is actually going to be a little bit shorter than normal, because typically I show off about 13 to 14 cards out of the entire deck, but we only have 10, and we've actually already talked about the commander and the card of the week, so that means there's only 8 more cards to discuss. So for the first time, I think we're actually going to talk about every single card in the entire deck, because there's 90 forests and we don't really need to talk about that. So with that little introduction out of the way, let's move into our themes for this deck. Obviously, forests are our major theme, and so like I said, since this is a shorter deck tech, we don't have as many themes this time. Instead of our normal 3, we're only going to talk about 2 this time. Our first one is going to be playing additional lands. There's a very good chance that we start this game with 5, 6, 7 lands in our hand. We want to be able to kind of ramp them out as quickly as possible to get Nissa into play and flipped as quickly as possible. So to that end, we have Summer Bloom, which is 1 and a green for a sorcery. You may play up to 3 additional lands this turn. Simple, effective, and it's a great way on turn 2 to go from 2 mana all the way up to 4, because we're playing, or no, I guess that's not how math works, is we go up to 5. This is why I gotta play 90 lands, because I don't know how math works, and this is just super simple and something I can do. So Summer Bloom is a great way to immediately get us to 5 lands. Then we can play Nissa, we tutor up a land, we play another one, we're at 6. We only got to hit 1 more to transform her, so we can do that as early as turn 4. Now, obviously, this is not the only theme of the deck, because we do need to have an actual way to win the game, and so that is where things like Abundant Harvest come in. Because we only have 10 non-lands, we can't just risk drawing land after land after land. We need cards like Abundant Harvest to find the pieces we need so that we can win the game. So Abundant Harvest is 1 green for a sorcery, choose land or non-land, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind, put that card into your hand, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. Since the vast majority of our cards in the deck are actively win conditions, in fact there's only about 2 that aren't going to push us toward a win in some way, this is going to be incredibly relevant. The odds of us choosing non-land and then hitting something else that we're capable of casting and possibly winning the game with is very, very high. So with that being said, we're going to skip ahead to our major key cards of the deck. We do have 3 of those this time. And the first key card I'd like to talk about is going to be Rites of Flourishing. And this doesn't look like much at surface value. It's 2 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card, and each player may play an additional land on each of their turns. Because we are almost guaranteed to be drawing 2 lands every single turn with Rites of Flourishing, this guarantees that we can then play those 2 lands every single turn. And while our opponents are also drawing 2 lands, they're going to be much less likely to have 2 lands every single turn that they can play, meaning we are going to start to skyrocket above our opponents in terms of mana and push ourselves to a point where we might be able to cast Nissa multiple times throughout the course of the game, generating a ton of value from her +1 ability, or being able to get her to her ultimate, tick her down -7, get all of our 6/6s, and then immediately recast her, make an Ashaya, have another token, and just kind of keep that value train going. So Rites of Flourishing is very useful, and it's also one of those cards that makes friends at the table, so people are going to be less likely to attack us until they realize that, well, Lost in the Woods is here and they're not going to be able to attack us at all. The next key card I want to talk about is Genesis Storm, and Genesis Storm is probably my favorite card in this entire deck. It is 4 green for a sorcery. When you cast this spell, copy it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-land permanent card. You may put that card onto the battlefield. Then, put all cards revealed this way that weren't put onto the battlefield on the bottom of your library in a random order. Since most of our cards are going to be non-land permanents that we want to be casting, we can just kind of dig our way through all of our 90 lands, find the 10 cards that we really want, and then put them into play. And obviously this isn't going to hit all of our cards. It's not going to, well, not going to hit itself with Genesis Storm. It's not going to hit things like Abundant Harvest or Summer Bloom, but it's going to hit Rites of Flourishing. It's going to hit Lost in the Woods, and it's going to hit some other key pieces, which we're going to talk about in just a second. So as long as we have cast Nissa 2 or 3 times, we can pretty much get every single card that we want out of our deck with a single Genesis Storm. And then finally, that leads us to our last key card, which is Abundance. So similar to Abundant Harvest, except this one is an enchantment, it's 2 green. If you would draw a card, you may instead choose land or non-land and reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of the chosen kind. Put that card into your hand and put all other cards revealed this way on the bottom of your library in any order. If we can somehow get Abundance in play as early as turn 4, we can just stack it so every time we draw a card, we draw a non-land, meaning we can go and find our Rites of Flourishing, our Summer Bloom, our Genesis Storm. We can find all these cards that make our deck function in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we were just randomly drawing cards off the top every single turn. This is also the point that I should mention, that this deck does not care about mulliganing at the very beginning of the game. I would highly recommend that if you pick this deck up, that you mulligan until you have at least 1 non-land card in your hand. Even if you have to go down to just 1 starting card in your hand, there's a very good chance, in fact a 90% chance, that you will draw a land and then be able to continue the game as normal. So that's just my suggestion if you decide to try this deck out. But those are all of our key cards. So the next thing we're going to do is take a look at some cool interactions in this deck. Now, normally, if you're paying attention to some of our other deck techs, we will have 2 separate cool interactions. That is, again, not the case this time, as this is a shorter deck tech due to the small number of cards, so we only have 1 cool interaction that I want to highlight. And this time, that is between Druid class and Explore. So, Druid class, 1 and a green, for a enchantment class. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain a life. Then you can level it up to level 2 for 3 mana. You may play an additional land on each of your turns. And for 5 mana, you can level it up to level 3. And when this class becomes level 3, target land you control becomes a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. It's still a land. Then we also have Explore, which is 1 and a green for a sorcery. You may play an additional land this turn. Draw a card. So the reason I wanted to highlight these 2 together is because playing additional lands is going to be incredibly relevant with Druid class in play, being able to gain us life every time a land enters. So while we may not have a ton of creatures that we can use to defend ourselves, this is going to be gaining us enough life that it's not really going to matter if our opponents are attacking us too much. Then, on top of all of that, we also have the win condition that comes along with Druid class, being able to make an elemental creature with power and toughness equal to the number of lands we control, which is very relevant when we're playing multiple lands a turn with Druid class and with cards like Explore. So while these 2 may not work specifically with each other, they synergize well enough with all the pieces in our deck that I wanted to highlight them and also show off the fact that Druid class is just phenomenal and Explore is also just absolutely incredible in this deck. Now, with all of that being said, we're going to move on to the final piece of our deck tech and talk about the price of the deck. Now, as you may be able to guess, since we have 90 lands, our deck is pretty cheap this week at $19.34. And yes, that does factor in the lands themselves into the budget. I believe they're taking up about $4 or so worth of the budget. So if you have 90 forests laying around, you could pick up this deck for about $15, which is not bad at all. Although I do understand that that is a bit expensive when we're talking about only 10 non-lands. However, a very large portion of that budget is taken up by our most expensive card and the real MVP of this entire deck. The only reason we haven't talked about it yet is because I was saving it for this end bit. And that is Cultivator Colossus at a massive $9.98, taking up half of our budget just on its own. It is 4 green for a plant beast. It's got trample. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, and when it enters the battlefield, you may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. If you do, draw a card and repeat this process. Now, I probably don't have to explain why this is so good, but with 90 lands in our deck, we can make Cultivator Colossus a 90 power creature with 90 toughness that has trample, and yes, it doesn't have haste, but just being able to do that is probably good enough. And it's got us to a point where we are able to continuously put lands into play, draw more cards, and essentially allow us to draw our entire deck and put every single land we want into play. Now, I would recommend not drawing the entire deck, maybe leave 4 or 5 cards so that way you don't accidentally mill yourself out, but being able to put this into play is massively powerful and absolutely game-winning, because not only is Cultivator Colossus getting power and toughness equal to the lands we control, but the elemental that is made from Druid class is also getting that powerful, and Nissa is turning them into other elemental creatures, and we are just able to absolutely have explosive turns with Cultivator Colossus. So obviously, I would recommend keeping this card in the deck if possible. However, if you are looking for a very cheap and very easy deck to put together, and you want to put it together for really about $5 if you have all of the basics, then you can cut Cultivator Colossus and throw in something else that would make it incredibly cheap to build. So, with that being said, normally we would talk about out-of-budget upgrades at this point, but since we have $80 of wiggle room, there isn't really an out-of-budget upgrade. However, I do have a quality of life upgrade. This is a card that I didn't really think about until I'd already put the deck together. So, if you get the chance to upgrade the deck a little bit, I would recommend throwing in Constant Mists, which is now a massive $17.34 for 1 and a green. Instant. It has buyback, you can sacrifice a land, and creatures deal no combat damage this turn. Normally, sacrificing a land would be a huge drawback, but since we're almost guaranteed to be drawing a land every single turn, that's really not much of an issue for us. So if we get to the point where we're struggling to find Lost in the Woods, or maybe we have Lost in the Woods and we were just that unlucky, we hit that 1 in 10, someone was able to get through combat damage, we can then use Constant Mists to still prevent the combat damage, making our opponents almost have to combo if they want to kill us. There's not really going to be any other ways to take us out. We will not be dying with combat damage with this deck. Now, if you are putting in a card, obviously you have to take a card out. You could always just take out a land, but where's the fun in that? So instead, you're going to probably try to keep it at 10. I would recommend taking out Explore. While we've already talked about this, it is a very good card. I think that in terms of the rest of the cards in the deck, it does fall a little bit short, and I think that for the exact same mana cost, getting Constant Mists is actually a lot more of what this deck wants to be doing. So that is my suggestion for you, and obviously, we now have to move on to see how this deck functions in a game. We got to test it out, see how it actually works, because just me sitting here saying, yeah, we have 90 lands, doesn't really matter much if I'm not going to back it up and show off the deck. But before we get to that point, I do want to take a second to highlight some of the ways you can help support the channel and shout out our current patrons and channel members as well. So a huge thank you to all of our patrons and channel members such as William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Jeff Winger, Jeffrey Boos, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Patty Wack, Richard, Devin Purser, Brian Haney, and Keegan Tawney. So to all of you, thank you all so much for all of your support, and if you would like to join this awesome group, please do check us out on Patreon or right here as a channel member. But with all of that being said, let's jump into this game, talk about some of our opponents, and see how our deck can function. So first up, obviously, our opponents. We are running up this week against Doodle, playing the Wise Mothman, Cow, playing Queen Kayla Bin Krug, and Richard playing Sharoom the Hegemon. So starting off with Doodle's Wise Mothman deck, this is kind of what every other Mothman deck wants to be doing. It wants to be proliferating and giving rad counters and milling. And so I think that Doodle leaned a little bit heavier into proliferate than a lot of the other versions of Mothman I've seen, which is very interesting and it leads to some very fun and unique game experiences. So I do think that that is a fun way to build around Mothman. I do think that Mothman is probably the strongest commander at the table. I have lost to Mothman many times. It's actually very rare that I see Mothman show up and not win a game. So I do think that Doodle's deck is target number one, definitely the one we want to look out for. But at the same time, I think that we both have a love-hate relationship with Mothman, because I don't think Mothman's ever really going to be able to do damage to us because of Lost in the Woods. However, we're going to keep milling for our rad counters because there's a very small chance we actually lose the rad counters. So we're probably going to start to rack up quite a few, and there is a possibility we wind up milling ourselves out. With that being said, though, we're going to move on to Cow's Queen Kayla bin Krug deck. And this is a deck that I am very excited to see. I haven't actually played against a Kayla deck before, but I know that the Boros style of artifacts and cheap creatures and things like that and reanimation is very cool, and I love seeing this change that's happened to Boros recently, and that it becomes a much more graveyard and artifact focused build. So I'm very excited to see what Cow can do. A lot of his builds are very impressive and have a lot of moving pieces. So I'm very excited to see what he can do with this one. And then finally, we have Richard playing Sharoom the Hegemon deck. Now, on the outside, this does look like kind of a random artifact deck, but he's actually trying to win the game with one very specific card, and that is actually Booby Trap. Now, I'll be honest, I have no idea how he intends to do that. I imagine there's a lot of copying triggers and the actual Booby Trap itself and milling, but I'm very interested to see how he's able to pull it off, because that is quite the unique win condition, and it's definitely one I haven't seen before, so I'm very excited to see if he can do it. But with all of that being said, those are our opponents for this week. Let me know down in the comments if you liked this shorter look at the deck tech. Obviously, it was done for a purpose this time, but if it's something people like, we can come back to it in the future. And then also let me know who you think is going to walk out of this game as the winner. Give me those predictions. I love seeing what people think about the game. So, with all of that being said, I hope you all enjoy the game. I'm sure I certainly will. And I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Doodle goes first, followed by Cow, myself, and then Richard. On Doodle's first turn, he plays a Drowned Catacombs. Cow plays a Myriad Landscape. I play a Forest. Richard plays a Razor Tide Bridge. Doodle plays an Overflowing Basin and casts Talisman of Dominance. Cow plays a Mountain. I play a Forest and cast Druid Class, gaining a life whenever I play a land. Richard plays a Watery Grave untapped, paying 2 life, then casts Emery Lurker of the Loch, milling 3 when she enters, and then being able to tap her to cast an artifact from his graveyard. Doodle plays a Mariposa Military Base tapped, gaining 2 rad counters, then cast Farseek, searching his library for a basic land and putting it into play tapped. Cow plays a Plains. I play a Forest, gaining a life, then cast Rites of Flourishing, letting each player draw an additional card in their draw step and play an additional land on their turn. Because of this, I'm able to play another Forest and gain another life. Richard plays a Path of Ancestry and a Rafine's Tower, then taps Emery to cast Talisman of Progress from the graveyard. After that, he casts a Ghoul Caller's Bell, which can tap to make each player mill 1. On Doodle's turn, he mills a land and a non-land for his rad counters, losing a life and one of his rad counters. Then he plays a forest and a swamp, and casts his commander, the Wise Mothman, giving each player a rad counter when it enters or attacks, and then, whenever a player mills a number of non-land cards, Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on a number of creatures equal to the non-land cards milled. Then, at the end of turn, Cow sacrifices his Myriad Landscape, searching his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On Cow's turn, he mills a non-land card, losing his rad counter, losing a life, and Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. Then, Cow plays a Fury Calm Snarl, revealing a plane so it comes into play untapped, and also plays a Buried Ruin. He then casts his commander, Queen Kayla bin Krug, letting him pay 4 and tap her to discard his hand, draw that many, and return an artifact or creature with mana values 1, 2, and 3 that he discarded to the battlefield. After that, he casts Savine's Reclamation, returning Myriad Landscape from his graveyard to the battlefield. On my turn, I mill a non-land for my rad counter, losing it and a life, while Doodle puts another counter on Mothman. I then play 2 forests and gain 2 life, and cast my commander Nissa Vastwood Seer, searching my library for a forest, putting it into my hand. After that, I level up Druid class, letting me play an additional land on each of my turns, and this lets me play a forest, gain a life, and transform Nissa since I have 7 lands, turning her into Nissa Sage Animist. I then activate Nissa's -2 ability, making a 4/4 elemental token named Ashaya the Awoken World. At the end of turn, Richard mills everyone for 1 with the Ghoul Caller's Bell, and since at least one of them was a non-land, Doodle also puts another +1/+1 counter on the Mothman. On Richard's turn, he mills a non-land, losing his rad counter and a life, while Doodle puts another counter on Mothman. Richard then plays a Spire of Industry and a Mistvault Bridge, then activates Emery to cast Orzhov's Signet from his graveyard, and also casts Demir's Signet. On Doodle's turn, he mills a land and a non-land, losing a life, losing a rad counter, and putting a +1/+1 counter on Mothman. He then plays an Evolving Wilds, sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. After that, he casts a Screeching Scorch Beast, letting Doodle make a number of 2/2 zombies equal to the number of non-land cards milled, but only once each turn. Then, we get this moment.
Richard, you're doing a lot.
I thought we were helping each other. Well,
oh, we are.
I'm gonna attempt a generous gift your commander then. Oh.
Appropriate reaction.
He's like, hold on, let me get Tamio's whatever real quick.
Doodle attacks Richard for 8 with Mothman, giving each player a rad counter, but before damage, Richard casts Generous Gift, destroying Mothman and giving Doodle a 3/3 elephant instead. On Cow's turn, he mills a non-land, losing his rad counter, losing a life, and Doodle makes a zombie. Cow then plays a mountain and a plains, and after that he casts Austere Command, destroying all creatures with mana value 4 or greater and all artifacts. Before that resolves, Richard activates Ghoul Caller's Bell, milling everyone for 1. On my turn, I mill a land for my rad counter, then play 2 forests, gaining 2 life. After that, I activate Nissa's +1 ability, revealing the top card of my library and putting it into play since it's a forest, gaining another life. Once that's resolved, I cast Explore, drawing another card and letting me play an additional land this turn, letting me play another 2 forests and gaining another 2 life. Finally, I level up Druid class to level 3, turning one of my forests into an elemental creature with power and toughness equal to the number of lands I control, which is currently 12. Since the forest has been in play, I move straight to combat, attacking Richard with it for 12 and Doodle for 4, but Doodle blocks with his elephant and zombie, killing the elephant and Ashaya while he takes no damage. On Richard's turn, he mills a land for his rad counter, then plays Odawara Soaring City, and casts Chromatic Orrery, letting him spend mana as though it were mana of any color, and it can also tap for 5 mana. This lets him activate Emery to cast Spellskite from his graveyard, allowing him to play a blue mana or 2 life to redirect any spell or ability to Spellskite. Then he casts Fabricate, searching his library for an artifact, in this case Witchbane Orb, putting it into his hand. On Doodle's turn, he mills 2 non-lands, losing both his rad counters and losing 2 life, then cast Guardian Project, drawing a card whenever he casts a creature that doesn't share a name with another creature under his control or in his graveyard. Then at the end of turn, Cow sacrifices his Myriad Landscape to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On Cow's turn, he cast Veronica, Dissident Scribe, letting him make a junk token whenever he discards a non-land card for the first time each turn. And after that, he activates Queen Kayla, discarding his hand of 6, making a junk token, drawing 6 cards, and returning Investigator's Journal, which gets 3 suspect counters, and Fareed, Enterprising Salvager, to the battlefield. After that, he plays a Phyrexia's Core and passes. On my turn, I mill a land for my rad counter, then play 3 forests, gaining 3 life, and activate Nissa's +1 ability, putting the forest on top of my library into play, gaining another life. At the end of turn, Doodle casts Putrefy, destroying Emery, but Richard responds by paying 2 life to change the target to Spellskite, destroying that instead. On Richard's turn, he mills a land for his rad counter, then plays a Shipwreck Marsh and casts his commander Sharoom the Hegemon, returning Spellskite from his graveyard to the battlefield when it enters. He then activates Emery, casting Orzhov's Signet from his graveyard, and also casts Arcbound Ravager, entering with a +1/+1 counter since it has modular 1, and letting him sacrifice an artifact to put a +1/+1 counter on itself. On Doodle's turn, he plays an island and an opulent palace, then casts Agent Frank Horrigan, proliferating twice when he enters or attacks, and at the end of turn, Cow removes a counter from his journal to draw a card. On Cow's turn, he plays a mountain and casts Slagstone Refinery, letting him make a tapped Power Stone token whenever a non-token artifact he controls goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. He also casts Rabbit Battery, and then activates Queen Kayla, discarding his hand of 5, making a junk token, drawing 5, and returning Soul Guide Lantern, exiling Oswald Fiddlebender from Richard's graveyard, and Sculpting Steel, which comes in as a copy of Sharoom, to the battlefield. When the Sharoom copy enters the battlefield, Cow returns Thopter Shop from his graveyard to the battlefield, then he moves to combat, attacking Nissa for 2 with Veronica, discarding a non-land card, drawing a card, and making a junk token. Then, in his second main phase, he plays a Rust Veil Bridge and passes. On my turn, I mill 3 lands for my rad counters, activate Nissa's +1 ability, putting a forest from the top of my library into play and gaining a life, then I play 2 more forests and gain 2 more life. I move to combat, attacking Cow for 19 with my elemental, but he blocks with Rabbit Battery, killing it and taking no damage. When the rabbit dies, Cow gets to draw a card from Thopter Shop, make a scrap token with Fareed, and make a tapped Power Stone with the Refinery. On Richard's turn, he mills 2 lands and a non-land, losing a life and a rad counter, then plays Academy Ruins, and activates Emery to cast Talisman of Progress from his graveyard, but in response, Cow sacrifices his Soul Guide Lantern, exiling each opponent's graveyard so he doesn't get the Talisman. This also gets Cow a scrap and a tapped Power Stone. Richard then activates the Chromatic Orrery, drawing 3 cards since he controls a permanent that's 3 colors, plays a Dark Water Catacombs, and casts Urza Lord High Artificer, making a construct with power and toughness equal to the number of artifacts he controls, which is currently 8, and also letting him tap his artifacts for a blue mana. On Doodle's turn, he casts the Great Henge, letting his creatures enter with an additional +1/+1 counter, letting him draw a card when a creature enters under his control, and also letting him gain 2 life whenever he taps the Henge for mana. After that, he recasts his commander, the Wise Mothman, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, drawing 2 cards, gaining 2 life, and giving everyone a rad counter. Then he cast Evolution Sage, putting a +1/+1 counter on it, drawing 2 cards, and now letting him proliferate when a land enters under his control, which he does by playing a forest. He also plays a Terramorphic Expanse, immediately sacrificing it to search his library for a basic land, putting it into play tapped. This triggers the Sage twice, letting him proliferate 2 more times. He then moves to combat and attacks Cow for 8 with Agent Frank Horrigan, giving it indestructible as it attacks, and proliferating 2 more times. Cow blocks with his copy of Sharoom, killing it, taking 3 from trample, making another scrap, another tapped Power Stone, and drawing a card. Then, at the end of turn, Cow casts Vanish into Eternity, exiling Richard's Chromatic Orrery. In response, Richard pays 2 life to redirect the spell to Spellskite, then sacrifices the Spellskite with Arcbound Ravager, putting a +1/+1 counter on it and sending the Spellskite to the graveyard rather than exiling it. On Cow's turn, he mills 4 lands and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life and losing 2 rad counters, while Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on Mothman and Horrigan. Then, Cow removes a counter from his Investigator's Journal to draw a card, plays a Hall of Tagson, and casts Dispeller's Capsule, which can be sacrificed to destroy an artifact or enchantment. Once that's resolved, he activates Queen Kayla, discarding his hand of 6, drawing 6, making a junk token, and returning to play a Durgar Hedgemage, which destroys the Great Henge and Guardian Project when it enters, Elixir of Immortality, and Lion Sash, which can be activated to exile a card from a graveyard, getting a +1/+1 counter if it's a permanent. Once all of that resolves, Cow casts Currency Converter, exiling cards he discards and being able to activate it to return them to his graveyard, making a treasure if it's a land or a 2/2 rogue if it's a non-land. On my turn, I mill 9 lands for my rad counters, then play 2 forests, gaining 2 life, activate Nissa's -2 ability, killing the Planeswalker and making another Ashaya token. Then I recast Nissa from the command zone, searching my library for a forest, putting it into my hand, playing it, gaining a life, transforming Nissa, and this time activating her +1 ability, putting a forest from the top of my library into play, gaining yet another life. Before I move to combat though, Cow activates Farid, sacrificing a scrap to goad my elemental, forcing me to attack Richard for 23 damage, but he blocks with Sharoom, killing it and taking no damage. Notably, he does put Sharoom into the graveyard. On Richard's turn, he mills 4 lands and 4 non-lands, losing 4 life and losing 4 rad counters, while Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. Richard then plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling Cow's graveyard, and in response, Cow activates Elixir of Immortality, gaining 5 life and shuffling both the Elixir and his graveyard into his library. After that, Richard also plays a Swamp, and then activates Emery, targeting his commander in his graveyard. In response, Cow activates Lion Sash, exiling Sharoom and putting a +1/+1 counter on the Sash. Once that resolves, Richard activates Urza, shuffling his library and exiling the top card of his library, being able to play it for free until the end of his turn. This lets him cast Wand of Denial, which can be tapped to look at the top card of target player's library, and if it's a non-land, he may pay 2 life to mill it. After that, he casts Conjurer's Closet, letting him exile a creature he controls at the end of his turn and then return it to play. This turn, when he moves to his end step, he exiles Urza, returning him to play and making another construct. On Doodle's turn, he mills a land for his rad counter, then casts Inexorable Tide, letting him proliferate whenever he casts a spell. He also plays a Woodland Cemetery and a Forest, proliferating twice, then casts Gyre Sage, which has Evolve, and taps for mana equal to the number of counters on it. This also triggers Inexorable Tides, letting Doodle proliferate a 3rd time. After that, he casts a Dusk Mantle Guildmage, proliferating again, and before combat, Cow sacrifices a scrap to goad Mothman. This makes Doodle attack me with Mothman, giving us all a rad counter, and attacks Cow with Frank Horrigan, proliferating twice on attacks, meaning I take 15 damage, while Cow blocks with Durgar Hedgemage, killing it and taking 14 damage through the trample. At the end of turn, Cow exiles the Great Henge from Doodle's graveyard with Lion Sash, putting a +1/+1 counter on it. Then, on Cow's turn, Doodle activates Duskmantle Seer, making his opponents lose a life whenever a card is put into their graveyard from anywhere. Then Cow mills 4 lands and 7 non-lands for his rad counters, losing a total of 18 life and 7 rad counters, while Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on each of his creatures. Once that resolves, Cow casts Chromatic Star and Zerta the Dawnwaker, making his activated abilities cost 2 less to activate, but not reducing them to less than 1. He also plays a Windscarred Crag, gaining a life, then removes a counter from his journal to draw a card, and casts Flame Scroll Celebrant, so whenever an opponent activates an ability that isn't a mana ability, they take 1 damage. On my turn, I mill 14 lands and 2 non-lands, losing 2 life and losing 2 rad counters, while Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on Gyre Sage and Evolution Sage. I then play 2 forests, gaining 2 life, and activate Nissa's -7 ability, turning 6 of my forests into 6/6 creatures, attacking Doodle with all of them for 65 total damage, and even though he blocks my elemental and 2 forests, killing the lands and the zombie, he still goes down to only 10 life. At the end of turn, Cow sacrifices Dispeller's Capsule to destroy Inexorable Tide, letting Cow make a scrap and a tapped Power Stone. Also at the end of turn, Richard activates Urza twice, shuffling his library and exiling the top card, letting him play it until the end of turn, hitting Clever Impersonator and Asinine Antics. On Richard's turn, he mills 3 lands and 7 non-lands, losing 7 life and 7 rad counters, while Doodle puts a +1/+1 counter on all his creatures. Then Richard casts Strionic Resonator, letting him pay 2 mana to copy a triggered ability he controls, and activates Emery, targeting Sculpting Steel. Then he casts Clever Impersonator from exile, coming in as a copy of Emery, milling himself for 3, copying it with the Resonator to mill 3 more, and killing the original. Notably, Urza's ability says until end of turn, not until the next end step, so Richard would not have been able to cast the spells he exiled with Urza last turn, but we don't catch that during this game. After that, he also casts Asinine Antics from exile, putting a cursed roll on each creature his opponents control, making them 1/1s. He again activates Urza twice, exiling Mind Stone and Meteor Golem, then casting them without paying their mana cost, destroying Evolution Sage when the Golem enters the battlefield. Then he's able to cast Sculpting Steel from his graveyard, entering as a copy of Meteor Golem, destroying Duskmantle Guildmage, and since Doodle now only has 1 blocker, Richard attacks him with both of his 13 power constructs, knocking Doodle out of the game. In his second main phase, Richard activates Urza again, exiling Astral Dragon from the top of his library and casting it, which enters and creates 2 token copies of Conjurer's Closet, except they're also 3/3 dragons. At the end of turn, Richard exiles Clever Impersonator, Sculpting Steel, and Meteor Golem, returning them to play, copying Meteor Golem twice due to how the triggers are stacked, destroying Lion Sash, Flame Scroll Celebrant, and Queen Kayla. In response, Cow casts Your Temple is under attack, giving his creatures indestructible. At the end of turn, Cow sacrifices Chromatic Star to draw a card, make a scrap, and a tapped Power Stone. Still at the end of turn, Cow activates Thopter Shop, tapping it to make a Thopter token, and activates Currency Converter, drawing a card and discarding a card. After that, but still at the end of turn, Cow activates Fareed, sacrificing a scrap in the Thopter to draw 3 cards, discard 2, and make a Junk token. On Cow's turn, he casts Glinthorn Buccaneer, doing 1 damage to each opponent whenever he discards a card. He then removes a counter from Investigator's Journal, drawing a card, then sacrifices the journal to draw another card, making a scrap and a tapped Power Stone. After that, he casts Osgir the Reconstructor, letting him sacrifice an artifact to give a creature +2/+0 until the end of turn, or letting him tap Osgir to exile an artifact from his graveyard and create 2 token copies of it. At this point, we also remember that Cow had 4 rad counters, so he mills a land and 3 non-lands, losing 3 life and 3 rad counters. After that, Cow activates Queen Kayla, but in response, Richard activates Wand of Denial, looking at the top card of Cow's library, which is a Battlefield Forge. Then, Kayla's ability resolves with Cow discarding 6 cards, drawing 6 cards, making a junk, and doing 6 damage to each opponent, knocking Richard out of the game. Then he returns to play a Soul Ring, Prized Statue, making a treasure token, and Glowing Dwarf Emissary, letting him make a treasure whenever he casts a historic spell. After that resolves, he casts Browlin Skyship Rider, doing 1 damage to each opponent and putting a +1/+1 counter on it whenever Cow discards a card, also making a treasure with Glowing. Once that's resolved, he sacrifices a junk, exiling Mishra Excavation Prodigy from the top of his library, being able to cast it this turn, which he does, now letting him make 2 red mana once a turn whenever he discards an artifact. Then he repeats the process, sacrificing another 2 junk, exiling Magus of the Wheel and Swiftfoot Boots, casting both of them, and equipping the boots to the Magus, giving it hexproof and haste, allowing Cow to immediately sacrifice the Magus to make each player discard their hands and draw 7 new cards. This winds up letting Cow put 5 +1/+1 counters on Browlin, make 2 red mana, while I take 10. Once that resolves, Cow equips Browlin with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving him hexproof and haste, and moves to combat, attacking me with all his creatures that are able to attack. On attacks, he discards a card and draws a card with Veronica, doing 2 damage to me and putting another counter on Browlin, so I take 14 total damage. On my turn, I mill 13 lands and a non-land to my rad counters, losing a life and a rad counter. I then play 3 forests, gaining 3 life, and cast Genesis Storm, copying it twice since I've cast my commander twice, revealing the cards from the top of my library until I reveal a non-land card, casting that card without paying its mana cost. Unfortunately, the only non-land left in my library is Lost in the Woods, so that's the only thing I put into play. Now, whenever a creature attacks me or a planeswalker, I reveal the top card of my library, and if it's a forest, that creature does no combat damage. Then I move to combat, attacking Cow with all my creatures for 54 damage, and before blocks he activates Thopter Shop, creating a Thopter token, and blocks all 6 of my creatures with his 6 untapped creatures, killing the Thopter, Osgir, Flamescroll Celebrant, Mishra, Farid, and Gloin, but keeping himself alive. In my second main phase, I activate Nissa's +1 ability, putting a forest from the top of my library into play and gaining a life. On Cow's turn, he mills a non-land for his final rad counter, losing it and a life. However, that doesn't stop him from activating Queen Kayla to discard his hand of 10 cards, doing 20 total damage to me, knocking me out, and winning Cow the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot longer than I thought this game was going to be when we sat down to play it. The game actually went about 2 hours long, so there were a lot of twists and turns, a lot going on, even though it was really only about 11 turns total. Every deck really got to do its thing and got to do what it wanted to do. Richard's deck did very well, but he just couldn't find the booby trap that he was looking for. He kept digging for it and had to tutor a couple times to get something to save him rather than the actual combo piece. So I know that he was a little disappointed he didn't get to show that off, but I do think it still performed very well. With Doodle, his Mothman deck also did very well. I think the Proliferate was very powerful and definitely put all of us kind of on the back foot trying to get out of this game before the rad counters killed us, which I think was a very unique interaction for the game to be having, where we weren't really worried about Mothman taking us out. We were much more worried about the rad counters. Moving on to Cow's deck, and obviously our winner for this game, his deck was very, very powerful. I think it was very cool to see all of the synergies and the discarding and drawing and free things and artifacts. It was just a very unique take on Boros, and I think it's a deck that really doesn't function without Queen Kayla, so I think that if we'd had a little bit more removal, there is a chance we could have done something to stop it, but unfortunately nobody was able to get rid of the Queen, so she just kind of had her way with the rest of the table. And then of course finally we got to talk about our deck, which also performed very well. I was very impressed with how often we were able to get a lot of our cards, even though we only had those 10 non-lands in the deck. Being able to play Nissa and constantly play lands and getting Druid class down early was very useful. I did mulligan until I hit a non-land, and I was lucky enough that it was Druid class, so very useful at that point, but I think it shows its power. I think that if we're against a bunch of decks that really want to win through combat, which unfortunately was none of the decks at this table, I do think that our deck does a lot better. I do think we got a little unlucky with our opponents all trying to win through non-combat damage, but you win some, you lose some. That's just how things go. So let me know down in the comments what you think of the deck. Let me know if there's any improvements you think we could make. Is 90 lands too many? Is 90 lands not enough? Let me know. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you would build a Lost in the Woods deck. So With all of that being said, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, please do like the video and subscribe to the channel. I would really appreciate it. It does help out a lot. But with all that being said, once again, thank you so much, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.